shoot you if I have to!
Get that door open! What is your primary objective?
Jack Bauer never called them enhanced interrogation techniques, but his fictional use of torture always seems to work. So many Americans assume torture must work just as well in real life. Only a long-awaited and contentious new report on torture released today by the U.S. Senate says just the opposite. Torture did not work in the fight for terror, and the details of what the U.S. did in the name of security and how we treated those we had captured has been turning stomachs and fueling debates all day. Humiliating abuse, physical assaults, and death threats. It's all detailed in a sweeping, damning indictment of the enhanced interrogation techniques secretly used by CIA officials after 9/11.
That America is big enough to admit when it's wrong.
The Senate Intelligence Committee's so-called torture report looks at 20 specific detainee cases. It concludes that the improved enhanced interrogation techniques were not effective.
I know from personal experience that the abuse of prisoners will produce more bad than good intelligence.
The abuse began with the CIA's first detainee, Al-Qaeda operative Abu Zubaydah, who was subjected to approved waterboarding seen here in a demonstration. In one session, the report says Zubaydah became, quote, completely unresponsive, with bubbles rising through his open, full mouth. The report says at one point when Zubaydah was being waterboarded, several CIA officials were, quote, profoundly affected, some to the point of tears and choking up. And as for the claims that Osama bin Laden was tracked down based on information gained from enhanced interrogation, the Senate committee says that's false. Former CIA officials, members of the Bush administration, and some Senate Republicans say the report,
it will endanger CIA personnel, sources, and future intelligence operations.
President Obama has since banned many of the interrogation techniques detailed in this report. The White House says that the president wanted it released for transparency and to show that America can learn from its mistakes. And as we begin our analysis and look at today's report and also the U.S.'s use of torture or enhanced interrogation techniques, we're joined first by John Sheeman. John is an associate professor of political science at Fairleigh Dickinson University. He's also written extensively on the use of torture and is currently writing a book on the CIA's application of that. Professor, thanks for a few minutes tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
You know, for a lot of people, the key to the use of torture or enhanced interrogation comes down to its effectiveness. Does it work or did it work in getting information that otherwise wouldn't have been available? We have a split of information. Today's report says it in fact did not work, but we've heard from several Bush officials, including Vice President Dick Cheney, as well as Obama Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, who said it was effective to a certain degree. What has your study led you to? What conclusion can we draw about the effectiveness of torture?
Very simply, not. So it's not effective. If we know this not simply from the current report, but if you look at both the history of torture and the logic of torture, my own research, torture simply isn't as effective as its proponents claim. It's not surprising that the architects of the program will argue that it worked, but you have to remember it's not simply this report that shows that it doesn't work, but there was a bipartisan group that came out with a long investigation, did a bunch of interviews, including with former interrogators and debriefers, and last year, and they found that it didn't work either and also amounted to torture. So in some ways, this really isn't surprising.
The primary problem for the use of torture is that it tends to produce false positives. People will say anything under torture in order to make the torture stop. Is that correct?
That's one of the problems, but actually, surprisingly, one of the greater problems is not getting any information at all. So anybody who's ever had a trip to the dentist and had a root canal thinks you'd say anything, but what's very surprising is that people often say nothing. We see this in the history of torture, but you see it in the report that came out today. 7 of the 39 detainees subjected to the more advanced techniques said nothing. So that's 18% that didn't say anything at all. And the CIA's own 1983 interrogation manual itself said that people are often surprised at how much pain they can withstand.
But let me just bear with me as I walk through this. If you use torture to gather information and you get either nothing, or you get false information, or maybe you get the correct information that you were looking for in the first place, that's at least more than you would have if you never tried the torture in the first place. I mean, it does seem like there is the potential for an upside to it, even if it's got a very low batting average, let's say.
So it is possible under certain very unlikely conditions to get good information. It's also possible to put out a fire with gasoline under certain conditions, but we're probably not going to start filling our fire trucks with gasoline. I would also suggest that getting a lot of false information or ambiguous information is not costless. What that means is analysts back at Langley are scurrying around, running to try to track down leads that lead nowhere. And what that means is they're not following up on the leads that they would have gotten, the good leads, had they used the standard interrogation approaches that have been so successful in the past.
Professor John Sheeman, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fairleigh Dickinson. Professor, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And my interview with Professor Sheeman continues online. Just head to YouTube, then search for Richard French Live. Rich?
You know, Andrew, one of the things, if you listen to the hearings and more of the details that came out of this, it wasn't just the waterboarding. I mean, give some of the graphic nature of some of the stuff that went out there. I learned a phrase didn't even know existed.
Yeah, well, I mean, we kept people awake. I'm trying to start.
But it's part of this dialogue,
well, I mean,
though. It's important.
We kept people awake for weeks. We killed innocent people. And then there's something that I'd never heard of until today. I think you're referring to something called anal feeding, which basically is food.
Yep, you can figure out the rest of it.
Right.
We had a guy who died of hypothermia out there. There was a guy that was awake, think about this for a minute.
For a week.
180 hours, I think the number was that he was kept. What possible reliable information do you think you can get? And there was more than that. And I'm going to lead to a question out of this. The people who were doing the interrogating were rank amateurs. These weren't interrogators. These were contractors they hired that were guys with violence issues to begin with. Congress was lied to. They lied to Congress. The vice president lied about this. They kept the information from the defense secretary. They kept this from Colin Powell because they know how he'd react.
They kept it from the CIA, kept it from the White House, they kept it from Congress, they kept it from everybody.
So the question is, and it was interesting, there was a debate whether or not this should have been released at all, okay, because it could have imperiled national security interests. Right now on alert there are, even though there's no actual intelligence, that you could have an embassy that would be targeted or other hard or soft assets internationally. Should this have been shared with the American public?
To answer your question, I think it's naive for anyone to believe that this wasn't going on all along. I mean, do we really think that this stuff wasn't happening?
I read through a lot today, Andrew, even more than me. I was surprised by the depth of it, by the scope of it.
Are you really surprised?
By that amount, yes. Only because I always believe no one's going to risk perjuring themselves on the floor.
That's a good point.
And
that is a good point.
Complete perjury took place, Andrew.
The other thing is the depth of what we did, the specifics of what we did. Our enemies know this because a lot of people have gotten out of Gitmo and would have shared the stories, and so you would have had a whisper campaign. So people would have known and have known for a long time what we did. And look, you know, it doesn't take much for our enemies to get more determined to attack us. So I don't think that is really a valid argument. Yeah, I mean, it might raise the security risks to the nation, but the security risks are always high to the nation anyway. When are you ever going to find the right time? Let me jump to the next question.
Let's say you and I agree that there was a value for this to be exposed. Again, here, nobody gets to make their own laws here. There's a reason we have a Congress. There's a reason we have a president, for Christ's sakes, right? What about now accountability? Nobody's accountable. We don't even know at this point if there's any even intent to hold accountable. There's a fascinating thing where, of all people, the ACLU said, pardon Bush, pardon the torturers that were involved in this for war crimes, because you got, you know, the international conventions, and the UN, whatever, saying that's where they go, it's not going to happen. But the point is, because then at least there'll be an acknowledgement that you can't do these war crimes anymore, and we are the standard bearer for the world.
And I had been arguing for a long time in 2007, 2008 on this show that we should prosecute the people who committed war crimes. That's the only way to prevent it from happening again.
What about the pardoning
The president doesn't want it to happen. It's not going to happen. And if you pardon them at this point, they're pardoned under U.S. law. But the U.S. would then be, and might already be, in violation of international law. And those people would be subject to arrest and detention and trial were they ever to leave the United States. Dick Cheney, theoretically, if he flies to, to Madrid, could be arrested and picked up and tried for war crimes.
Richard, there'll be no punishment. And I venture to say, as we pay attention to polling in the next couple of days, most Americans will probably agree, polling-wise, that this was necessary. After 9/11, the climate of terrorism will agree that it was necessary to do this for safety here in America.
And there's an argument that the CIA did this in part, or that the administration did this in part, to respond to that American bloodlust, that people wanted this to a certain degree.
Listen,
they wanted people to pay.
We debate a lot of times, and you and I don't even see eye to eye. I see more value for U.S. interventionism more so than I think you do, I think, by and large, over the years, Andrew. But we are America. We are better than the terrorists. And when it doesn't even work, is this really who we want to be? That'd be my final 2 cents on this one. But as Dominic said, it'll be fascinating. I'm going to be really curious what the American public has to say now that this information, this evidence is out there. Okay, when we come back, we talked quite a bit about the protest here since last week, really, and even before that, after the Ferguson decision. We're going to take a look here about them and how effective they've been, or if they've just become to the point of annoyance. We'll talk about that after this.